Former President Trump has said that he would favor a 10% across the board, not just China, across the board tariff. And of course, and actually, Mr. Lighthizer, his advisor section, maybe we increase that to eliminate trade deficit. What would that do to the growth of the American economy?
Okay, now a dirty little secret of international trade economics is that moderate tariff rates do not, at least according to our models, and as far as we can tell in practice, don't have huge growth effects. They distort consumption and production choices. They do some damage, but to get really big numbers, you have to get well beyond 10%. So of course, if the goal is to eliminate the trade deficit, Lighthizer was going to have a surprise because tariffs don't eliminate trade deficits unless they get so high as to basically make trade impossible. So we would be talking about much, much higher tariff rates potentially. What's worries me is not, I think there are a lot of really negative consequences if the U.S. does a 10% tariff, but they're sort of geopolitical more than anything else. They would mean that the United States is basically saying, well, we're opting out of our role as a leader of the global economy. It would have a lot of bad effects. In terms of the economic impact, I'm hearing talk about, well, let's have 60% tariffs on imports from China. And, roughly speaking, the adverse effects of a tariff are proportional to something like the square of the tariff rate. So a 60% tariff is, 36% times as bad as a 10% tariff. So if we start to get into those kinds of tariffs, yeah, then we are actually talking about significant negative impacts.
You are the author most recently of a book called Arguing with Zombies. And
Yeah.
one chapter in there, which was actually, I think, taken from some work you did just around the time of the Great Financial Crisis, was how did economists get it so wrong? Some people are asking the question today about inflation, where it looks like most economists got it wrong one way or the other, maybe in different ways, duration, size, things like that. What's your sense of why so many economists did get it wrong this time?
Okay, now first of all, we've just gone through an absolutely crazy period, right? You don't find disruptions comparable to what COVID-19 did, unless you go back to the 1940s and the transition back to a peacetime economy after World War II. And by the way, the White House made that analogy right at the beginning, and it took a while, but it looks like a pretty good analogy right now. Um, Most of us didn't see. I would fault myself for not realizing just how pervasive the disruptions were going to be. I was looking much too narrowly, much too concretely. I was looking at the price of lumber and not at how the whole labor market would be discombobulated by the effects of the pandemic. And so, what would have been a modestly inflationary fiscal expansion turned into something much bigger for a little while. Um, the it's kind of not surprising that people got that kind of thing wrong. We don't have any recent historical experience to base it on, and so there was a lot of guesswork involved, and most of us just completely failed to understand the scope. The less forgivable thing was all of the people, Larry Summers most prominently, but lots of people who said this is like the 70s all over again. And getting inflation down is going to require years of high unemployment. And there was never a good reason to believe that. There were always, we do have a kind of a standard analysis of stagflation, of why it happens and how it happens. And that analysis said, look, we just don't have the kind of entrenched expectations of inflation that we did back in 1979, 1980. So we shouldn't expect a replay of past disinflations. So, there were, it's predictions are hard, especially about the future, Yogi Berra. But in this case, I think there was a failure of imagination, which is what I blame myself for, failure to realize just how wild and crazy the times we were living in were. But there was also a kind of urge to revisit past stories. You got into a mode of disaster thinking, and you start to see all possible disasters as being guaranteed, and that was the source of the really bad predictions, the dire predictions for 2023, which didn't come true.